Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. This week we're going to hear closing statements in relation to modules 1 and 2 from a number of core participants. At our suggestion, the lawyers who are going to make these statements on behalf of their clients have all agreed to do so remotely. So we're going to be going to various remote locations, and I shall need on each occasion to ensure that we have the contact that we need to have in order for this to work well. The first person we're going to hear from is Miss Barwise, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of those of the core participants represented by what we now call Team 1. I can see Miss Barwise on my screen. Miss Barwise, can you see me?
I can indeed, sir, yes.
Good, thank you. Well, I can hear you, and I gather you can also hear me.
I can.
So you're going to make the first of the closing statements on behalf of your clients, and if you're ready to go, we'll look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, indeed, sir. Good morning, Mr. Istefan and Mr. Akbor as well. You have our written submissions. Yep. What I say now is by way of overall summary. I shall begin with Module 1 and then address Module 2. First, an overview of Module 1. Despite being a legacy and very high-profile project for RBKC and the only building it had ever overclad, the refurbishment of Grenfell was hastily conceived by an inept design team with a hapless lead consultant, Studio E, inexperienced in high-rise and cladding projects. Studio E failed to familiarise itself with the relevant parts of building regulations relating to external fire spread and cavity barriers, as it should have done to ensure a compliant design. Procurement rules, both in relation to the retention of the design team and the ultimate contractor, Ryden, were flouted by TMO. TMO capped the fees of each design team member beneath the threshold at which the procurement rules would apply to avoid the need for public procurement. Although an OJU procurement process took place for the contractor, TMO breached the rules by illicit and unilateral dealing with Ryden prior to its conclusion. TMO's breaches of procurement rules may have resulted in the selection of both an architect and contractor ill-equipped to carry out the project. Studio E accepts it would have been unlikely to win a competitive tender process. Madison admitted TMO's unilateral communications with Ryden posed a potential risk of challenge due to a breach of the public procurement rules. The project was wrong-footed from the start by Studio E's specification failing to specify performance requirements and instead prioritising aesthetics. From the outset, Studio E failed to address the requirements of a compliant cladding system. Studio E's cladding design, as finalised by Ryden and Harley, the cladding subcontractor, was patently non-compliant with building regulations and ADB. Had Harley adhered to its subcontract, the cladding panels would, as a minimum, have been Class 0 and should, according to the inquiry's cladding expert, Mr. Secular, have been FR as opposed to PE, and the insulation would have had to be limited combustibility. Pushing the windows out from their original concrete frames into the cladding meant they were not bounded by effective cavity barriers, since cavity barriers are ineffective within metal rain screen cladding. The compliance of the facade with the functional requirement B4, external fire spread, of the building regulations was never established. Exova bears a significant responsibility for the disaster as the ultimate specialist, given its failure to point out, despite continued involvement in the project, that the entirety of its reports were unreliable, absent the analysis of the cladding's impact on external fire spread. The fundamental non-compliance of the design was exacerbated by workmanship, but even perfect workmanship could not have rescued this flawed design. Despite its patent non-compliance, the project was signed off by RBKC's Building Control Department, whose Mr. Hoban demonstrated a woefully flimsy grasp of building regulations. The refurbishment project is characterised by the lack of competence of most of the construction professionals, their seeming ignorance of their obligations, and refusal to take professional responsibility for their actions. Before turning to the responsibility of the main protagonists, I address 2 points generally raised by way of defence. First, that non-compliance is due to a lack of clarity in the regulations. This is a flawed argument. Whilst it's clear ADB was in many respects unclear and is not fit for purpose, building regulations were clear as to the outcomes required, namely the functional requirements. It was clear external walls must not promote flame spread and that ADB must be interpreted in that light. Whilst the inquiry's experts are critical of the regulatory regime, both Professor Torero and Mr. Hyatt consider that building regulations and ADB, albeit flawed, were sufficiently clear to produce a satisfactory outcome. ADB Section 12 expressly alluded to the safety risk posed by combustible cladding and extensive cavities. It also referred to BR 135. That document contained warnings regarding previous cladding fires and contained a graphic diagram showing the mechanism by which fire could break out and repeatedly break back in to a high-rise building. The diagram was replicated in Celatex's compliance guide. It was absolutely clear, if following the linear or prescriptive route, then limited combustibility insulation must be used. None of the designers or contractors can say with any credibility they were not warned. A quick squint at the test route option and BR 135 would have warned them of the dangers of combustible material on high-rises. Studio E, Ryden and Harley knew the cladding had a plastic core. REC handled a sample and knew it was some sort of plastic. Soons did by implication, as he specifically referred to his long-standing knowledge of the Leucobond, which he equated to ACM. The 2009 Leucobond brochure, which Soons introduced in cross-examination, entitled From a Pioneer to the Synonym, showed diagrammatically that a Leucobond had a plastic core and stated a Leucobond composite could be considered a plastic. Soons was aware from the Sun Valley fire that PUR insulation was a fire hazard, but unconvincingly claimed he thought PIR was different. Crawford was aware metal cladding burns and falls off. Blake of Ryden was aware ACM panels often contained a PE core, which he understood was plastic and combustible. Daniel Anktel-Jones's email at the time said, as we all know, ACM will be gone very quickly in the event of a fire. But in cross-examination, he denied, unconvincingly, that anyone was aware the materials were combustible. Most school children know that plastic melts when heated. No credence should be given to contractors and designers who claim ignorance. ADB's flaws were not the cause of the non-compliant cladding, which included insulation which was not of limited combustibility. It would be completely wrong to exonerate the professionals and contractors on the ground that the guidance, which most of them did not even trouble to read, was at fault. Something more significant is at play than confusion in the guidance. Building regulations are primarily concerned with life safety, and the failure of Grenfell's designers and contractors to familiarise themselves adequately or at all with regulations and ADB, coupled with their deliberate incuriosity as to the products, is tantamount to a total neglect of safety. Grenfell demonstrates the existence of a culture of non-compliance within certain sectors of the construction industry. Put bluntly, there is a kind of recklessness as to whether or not compliance is achieved. No one addressed the requirements for facade compliance. No one considered it their responsibility to fully read the BBA certificate for Rayner Bond's cladding panels to discover that the panels were available in FR and that the claimed Class 0 did not apply to smoke silver panels or indeed to any PE panel. only Mr. Lamb, Harley's subcontractor, understood that the lack of cavity barriers around windows rendered the facade non-compliant, but he relied on Harley's apparent satisfaction and failed to raise this with Studio E. Ryden and Harley's failure to escalate the lack of cavity barriers to Studio E is a striking example of willful non-compliance. Ryden and Harley understood the importance of cavity barriers from the Taplow House fire, yet did not use this knowledge at Grenfell, despite Siderise advising of a weak link for fire at the windows. No credible explanation was offered by any witness for failure to heed this clear warning. The non-compliance of Grenfell's facade was not caused by a lack of clarity in the guidance, since the designers and contractors were generally not conversant with it. The second common line of defence is that the party in question is exonerated by the fault of others. Doubtless, the inquiry will have no difficulty with the concept that the degree to which each party bears responsibility is not automatically reduced by someone else being at fault, assuming causation can be proved. Whilst the manufacturers knowingly misled the market, this cannot exonerate those who failed to understand ADB. Equally, the fact that had the designers understood ADB properly, they would have rejected RS 5000 and K15 does not exonerate the manufacturers, given their intention to exploit the confusion. Taking each of those primarily responsible within Module 1, not necessarily in order of responsibility, I start with Studio E. Prior to novation, Studio E, as lead consultant, was responsible to TMO for investigating the effect of statutory compliance at stages C to E, and soon admitted this included compliance with building regulations, including fire safety. Studio E misunderstood its contractual obligations post-novation. Soons considered under the design and build route, all design responsibility lay on the contractor. Soons wrongly concluded that Studio E could therefore rely on Ryden and Harley's design expertise without checking Harley's designs. Hyatt is clear that neither the spectrum of design possibilities under the design and build umbrella nor the version of it selected at Grenfell altered the RIBA design stages or Studio E's obligations. Its initial failure to produce a code-compliant design, coupled with its inexperience and naivety in trusting Ryden and Harley were competent, led directly to the design being non-compliant. Studio E's closing submissions reject Mr. Hyatt as an expert on the grounds he does not have the requisite experience in cladding. Hyatt does not fault Studio E for their inexperience in cladding. Rather, he opines how a competent architect would have approached the question of compliance. Studio E also criticises Hyatt and the inquiry for failing to consider the widespread non-compliance of some 2,000 other high-rise clad buildings in England and Wales. If Mr. Sacula's evidence is accepted, this was, however, not a universal problem. Furthermore, it is clear from contemporaneous guidance, such as the standard for systemised building envelopes produced by the Centre for Windows and Cladding Technology and referred to in the Grenfell NBS specification, that facades should not be composed of materials which readily support combustion or add significantly to the fire load, that aluminium cladding does not offer significant resistance to fire, and that composites might delaminate, posing a hazard to firefighters and occupants. Importantly, it also discounted Class 0 as an adequate metric of reaction to fire. Building Control Alliance TGN 18 advised that if following the linear route, both cladding and insulation should be of limited combustibility. And it was clear from NHBC's July 2015 technical extra guide that PIR or PUR insulations were not limited combustibility. Its Studio E suggests that the standard of care is to be set by the incompetent and willfully non-compliant sector of industry. That is clearly a bad point. Studio E's seeming confusion about its contractual obligations is barely credible, and its failure to negotiate terms under which it could operate, namely a cap on liability, meant that taking on the project with full and unlimited liability was, as Soons noted at the time, irresponsible and may have meant it was uninsured. It is to Studio E's discredit that it claimed it was effectively press-ganged into signing the contract with Ryden in 2016 on terms with which it claimed not to agree, when those terms had been on the table since April 2014. Instead of confessing its administrative incompetence and weakness, Studio E sought instead to argue its appointment was limited in two respects. First, that Lawrence had suggested to both Soons and Crawford that Studio E's role would be merely responsive to Ryden's requests. Something may have been said by Lawrence, but it was insufficiently clear to vary the terms of the written agreement and was never reduced to writing. Second, Crawford sought to artificially confine the term design intent such that Studio E was not liable for statutory compliance by stamping drawings conforms to design intent. Instead, Crawford claimed Harley alone was responsible for statutory compliance. Hyatt rightly disagrees. Studio E was the author of its own misfortune. Its failure to even consider the statutory requirements for the cladding at the outset left it at the mercy of unscrupulous manufacturers and their agents, and led it to prepare an essentially proprietary specification instead of identifying performance criteria. Studio E created the specification by cutting and pasting from the NBS facilitative online platform. This gives unrivaled exposure of products to decision makers, but encourages a lack of adherence to ADB by presenting model clauses with drop-down links to a dizzying array of product options without indicating conformity with ADB over 18 metres. Hyatt doesn't fault Studio E's failure to specify required performance criteria, saying instead, many of us would have blindly stumbled into that same problem. That said, Hyatt considers that a competent architect would have considered the approved documents, CWCT guidance, and product literature before preparing the NBS specification. The inquiry might therefore properly conclude that a competent architect should have stipulated fire performance criteria as opposed to cutting and pasting from the NBS. Given that Studio E chose a proprietary specification, it had to ensure compliance of both the main product specified and alternatives. The specification of Celotex FR 5000, later RS 5000, put Studio E in breach of its obligation to ensure compliance. And the fact that Max Fordham initially volunteered FR 5000 is nothing to the point. Critically, Hyatt finds fault Studio E for failing to require Exova to revisit the statement made in each version of its fire strategy that the proposed changes would have no adverse effect in terms of external fire spread, but would be confirmed by analysis. Neither Exova nor any fire engineer provided the analysis. Crawford claims he did not pursue this because Exova's Ashton assured him of the compliance of ACM and Celotex by phone call. This is not credible, given it is not mentioned in Crawford's statements and contemporaneous email exchanges. In Hyatt's opinion, Studio E should have reverted to Exova once the rain screen cladding was selected. Ryden equates responsibility with blame. It suggests those to whom it delegated are to blame. Ryden was responsible to TMO for the design, both that originally prepared by Studio E and as finalised by Ryden. Ryden's Mr. Lawrence admitted Ryden should spot obvious non-compliance with building regulations. On any view, there were obvious non-compliances which Ryden should have observed and corrected. First, failure to have selected any route to compliance, thereby defaulting to the prescriptive route, but using RS 5000 and K15, neither of which were limited combustibility insulations. Second, failure to ensure there were cavity barriers around windows. Ryden bore primary responsibility also in some respects by selecting products together with SD plastering, such as the UPVC window surrounds and the insulation behind them, through which fire readily escaped into the cladding. Ryden also blames Arconic for dishonestly producing a dangerous product and others for selecting it. This overlooks Ryden's role in advocating ACM without questioning its safety, because it increased Ryden's profit margins as it is cheap. Ryden was intimately involved in the selection of ACM and urged the planners to accept it. Ryden's willful blindness in failing to consider ACM's fire performance should not exonerate it. Blake was aware it was plastic and combustible. Ryden knew just how cheap ACM was because it would make a £200,000 windfall profit by using face fixed and £127,000 profit on cassette fixed, albeit such savings were shared 50-50 with Harley. Ryden protests that the offline meeting held in March 2014 in breach of procurement rules was not causative because ACM was priced within the tender. That is a bad point. The saving offered by Ryden in the meeting held in breach of OJU procurement rules was a significantly larger discount than that originally offered in Ryden's tender. The illicit post-tender negotiations therefore guaranteed ACM's selection. Albeit the saving to TMO increased in the illicit negotiations, Ryden's profit margin on the saving had yet to be agreed with Harley. This despite Ryden having declared a 12.5% profit margin by its tender. Ryden asserts it was not prohibited from making a secret profit. It was. This was a publicly tendered contract in which Ryden had declared a profit margin. By secretly pocketing additional savings, Ryden increased its profit margin over that declared. Had TMO known, Ryden should not have been awarded the contract on those terms. As to Harley, its drawings show non-compliance with ADB diagram 33, as horizontal cavity barriers did not align with compartment floors and the window head. Harley also failed to alert Studio E to the lack of cavity barriers around windows, despite Lamb noticing their absence. Harley selected highly combustible TP10 and styrofoam as the insulating cores for window infill panels and failed to carry out any checks of their fire performance or compliance. Lamb proposed TP10 because it was class 0 without determining compliance, despite being aware of restrictions on insulation above 18 metres. Harley's Mark Stapley selected styrofoam, which Lamb unquestioningly accepted. Ryden did not address compliance. Hughes confirmed he assumed Harley's specification notes were compliant. Exova, as the fire engineer, bears significant responsibility. It contracted with TMO to prepare an initial appraisal and then a fire strategy for Grenfell as refurbished. That would comprise a preliminary fire strategy in stage C to be detailed in stages D to E, with adjustments in stage F, meaning input from Exova after Ryden's appointment. Exova's initial stance was that it was excluded after November 2013, but this was not borne out by the evidence. Exova's retainer was not terminated, and Exova did not implement its closure procedures. The inquiry's fire engineer experts agree that the fire strategy is the key document governing life safety, and therefore Exova played a critical role. Exova was acutely aware it had not provided the B4 analysis supporting its statement that the changes would not adversely affect external fire spread. Ashton was asked for ad hoc advice in September 2014, at which point it should have been clear that Grenfell's facade was non-compliant in at least 2 respects. There were no cavity barriers around windows, and RS 5000 insulation was not limited combustibility. Dr. Lane concludes that at latest, that was the moment to cogently indicate the need to complete the fire strategy. Instead, Ashton gave poor advice, suggesting cavity barriers were only needed if insulation was combustible, ignoring that they were needed in any event. Lane's evidence was that Ashton should have said he could not properly advise because he did not know what system was proposed. Exova, as ultimate fire specialist, should have raised the alarm that the fire strategy for the cladding had not been addressed. It failed to do so. Had Ashton opened the link to the Stage C report, as Lane considers he should, he would have appreciated the cladding was zinc and the insulation was Celotex FR. The fact that the zinc cladding was subsequently changed to ACM does not reduce Exova's negligence in asserting changes including metal cladding would have no adverse effect, albeit this was stated to be confirmed by analysis in a future report. The statement that the cladding would have no adverse effect was always incorrect, misleading, and should never have been made, even when zinc cladding was proposed. While Studio E and Ryden knew the cladding had evolved from the Stage C report and that the cladding strategy had not been considered, their negligence in failing to ensure the strategy was considered does not break the chain of causation, given Exova had been paid for the analysis and should, when asked to give ad hoc advice, have advised it remained outstanding. Exova also bears some responsibility for the lack of adequate means of escape for those with disabilities. Exova wrongly considered the law did not require it to consider means of escape for the disabled, and that assumption underlay their fire strategies. Exova failed to question the occupancy of Grenfell, despite being aware of evacuation lifts. Ashton claimed he would only question occupancy in the case of an elderly person's home. Exova's failure to question occupancy is significant, given Lane's opinion that a building's risk profile is a function of its occupancy and fire growth rate. As to the manufacturers, they insist their responsibility is subsidiary to those who specified their products. Arconic insists that if its ACM-PE had not been chosen, another ACM-PE would have been. That may be so, but both Arconic and Celotex went to great lengths to ensure their products were used at Grenfell. It therefore does not lie in their mouths to seek to reduce their responsibility for the disaster or to suggest their dishonesty was not causative. First, Arconic. Ms. French explained Arconic set yearly targets for Rainabond to increase its UK market share. Arconic achieved this by a deliberate marketing strategy of cultivating relationships with fabricators to ensure Rainabond was put forward to specifiers. The relevant fabricator, CEP, had a long-standing commercial relationship with Arconic. As Blades admitted, CEP would keep tabs on projects and then propose Arconic. So it was at Grenfell. CEP introduced Studio E to Arconic in October 2012. Blades quoted for a Rainabond ACM, despite the then specification not requesting ACM. He was unable to explain this, but admitted his intention was to ensure Rainabond ACM was used at Grenfell. In December 2013, CEP contacted Harley, and Harley asked CEP to quote only for a Rainabond ACM system. French admitted Harley and CEP were instrumental in ensuring the selection of Rainabond. As to Celotex, whilst it has shown greater candour than Kingspan in admitting fault, Celotex's candour is marred by the artificiality of its insistence that its actions were not causative, and it overlooks an important piece of evidence. Celotex regarded Grenfell, specifically Harley, as a target. Grenfell was at the top of Celotex's must-win projects list, emailed by Room to a Saint-Gobain company in November 2014. This reflected Celotex's desire to use Grenfell as its flagship case study to push our RS 5000 onto more high-rises. Harley correctly saw Celotex as being very keen. The day after RS 5000 launched, Celotex alerted Harley, sent the RS 5000 literature, and offered to attend Harley's offices to present the new product. Celotex was so desperate to ensure RS 5000 was used at Grenfell that it used its relationship with its supplier Zig to give Harley an abnormally high discount of 47.5%. Celotex intended designers and contractors to rely on its misleading marketing. Celotex's internal presentation, above 18 metres, in May 2014 stated, "Nobody understands the test requirements. Architects ask if it can be used above 18 metres. The answer is yes." Crawford and Lawrence demonstrated this by taking comfort from assurances in Celotex's product data sheet that RS 5000 was the first PAR to successfully test to BS 8414 and therefore was acceptable for use over 18 metres. In conclusion to our Module 1 submissions, we suggest the major underlying problem is that of competence. Currently, only the term architect is a legally protected title. The generic term engineer, as opposed to defined grades including chartered engineer, is not, and nor is fire engineer. Being a chartered fire engineer is not a prerequisite to describing oneself as a fire safety engineer. From the public's perspective, it is not clear which persons are qualified fire engineers. If titles were defined and protected by legislation, others would then not be able to use that generic term. Core curricular and CPD requirements could be defined by the registering body under such legislation, as does ARB under the Architects Act. The inquiry will doubtless wish to consider also inviting ARB to revise the guidance it gives as to the parts 1 to 3 criteria for architects, and whether this should, as Hyatt suggests, have a more technical foundation and be more specifically focused on statutory compliance, not just in relation to fire, but all aspects. Turning to Module 2, the evidence tells a story which reaches much further than the confines of Grenfell. The products used at Grenfell were either not tested in a legitimate way or not successfully tested to the standards their BBA certificates claimed. These facts either were or should have been appreciated by the independent certifiers and test houses and senior figures within them. The whole certification process may properly be regarded as positively dangerous, since it creates a veneer of respectability, which in some cases serves to conceal test results obtained by dishonest testing. Whilst independent certifiers and test houses are not regulators, they are bound to retain integrity and independence and test in accordance with the recognised test procedures. The frauds practiced on the market by Kingspan, Celotex and Arconic were compounded by the certifiers and test houses, whose complicity cannot be explained by mere incompetence. The manufacturers and certifiers or test houses' contemporaneous behaviours are now exacerbated by their lack of candour and ability to reflect fully on their behaviour, demonstrated by almost every witness for the manufacturers and most of those for the independent certifiers and test houses. Whilst the certifiers BBA and LABC recognised shortcomings in their procedures, both were contemporaneously hopelessly weak and did not properly action the warnings they received from a senior civil servant, Brian Martin, in July 2014. Martin warned BBA that its First Amendment certificate for K15 erroneously described K15 as limited combustibility. BBA dismissed this as simply down to human error, but without examining the true cause of the error. Martin also alerted NHBC to his concerns that foam insulations were being mistaken for limited combustibility, and that email was forwarded to LABC. These warnings, some 3 years before the Grenfell fire, were not recognised by the certifying bodies as an indication they were being duped. Alternatively, the certifiers were aware they were to some extent being duped. Even now, BBA notes there is a balance to be had between fairness and robustness, but BBA allowed that balance to tip far too far in the manufacturer's favour. Amongst the manufacturers, Kingspan's brazen denials have only become louder during Module 2, and Arconic still inhabits a parallel universe in which it is legitimate to assert that technically its product might be regarded as Class B, despite Wehrle and Schmidt's admissions that the relevant test was engineered to pass. Arconic still insists its PE product could still be regarded as Class 0, even though it, unlike the FR version, was never tested to BS 476. Only Celotex admits faults and has taken corrective action. The only truthful voices were Jonathan Roper and Jamie Hayes of Celotex. Hayes acknowledged his failure at the time to challenge fraudulent behaviour was a failure of courage and a failure of character and a failure of moral fibre. The otherwise widespread lack of candour is an affront to the dead, the bereaved, and the former residents of Grenfell. The other issue which emerges strongly from the evidence is the degree to which certain manufacturers, notably Kingspan, lobbied industry bodies which issue guidance, such as NHBC and BCA. Kingspan's campaign to influence government policy in the aftermath of Grenfell is particularly shocking, as the fire should have prompted a sea change in culture and attitude to safety. Kingspan's sole large-scale BS 8414 test on K15 at the time of supply to Grenfell had been carried out in 2005 and was 14 years old at the date of its withdrawal, shortly before Module 2 began. Kingspan's witnesses admitted it was a wholly unrealistic test, not representative of any ordinary building system. Baker at BRE described it as an indicative test when asked to issue a classification report confirming the test result met BR 135 a decade later. Furthermore, the 2005 test was only relevant for a few months, as K15's formulation materially changed in 2006 with the production of new tech, which meant the 2005 test was no longer applicable to the product being sold. By the time Kingspan gained its first BBA certificate for K15 in 2008, which relied solely on the 2005 test, the certificate was irrelevant to the version of K15 being sold. New tech's fire performance was much worse than old tech, as was demonstrated in the METS-EXOTEC test of December 2007. Despite Meredith's 2008 report of the test, quoting BRE's opinion that the K15 product had materially contributed to the failure, nevertheless, Kingspan's closing submissions deny new tech was worse than old tech. These denials are absurd, given further testing of new tech served only to establish its poor performance. A second attempt, METS-EXOTEC test in 2008, failed, and Meredith's April 2008 report recorded that tests on new K15 showed a quicker time to ignition and double the heat output compared to old tech, which he said confirmed initial suspicions in respect of reaction to fire. By email thread in June 2008, titled K15 Problems, Kingspan Offsite, a Kingspan subsidiary, was described as experiencing a very dramatic test failure with K15. Despite that, Kingspan resolved not to reveal to Offsite that the dramatic failure was due to K15's formulation having changed. Instead of being concerned about new K15's safety, Rochefort decided instead to ensure Offsite only used old tech for testing. Rochefort's claim that he had meant Kingspan should revert to selling only old tech was palpable nonsense, both at odds with the words used and with Kingspan's actions, which were to continue selling new K15. Kingspan obtained K15's BBA certificate in 2008 and used that certificate to procure an LABC registered detail, which wrongly described K15 as limited combustibility. Kingspan's Meredith and Philip Heath were well aware at the time that the LABC certificate wrongly described K15 as limited combustibility, but testing was put on hold given this happy outcome for Kingspan. Only once knowledgeable entities such as NHBC and Wintec began challenging Kingspan did it reluctantly resume research and development and testing efforts. Millichat describing BS 8414 testing as a constant pain in the arse for as long as he could remember. As the 2005 test was carried out under BS 84141, namely against masonry, Kingspan also had to overcome the problem that despite its suggestions to the contrary, K15 had not been tested under BS 84142 for steel-framed buildings. Following initial failures in early 2014, it eventually passed in July 2014, but in doing so, Kingspan was perpetrating a further fraud, as the version of new K15 used to pass the test was an R&D version, which had a significant positive impact on fire performance. Millichap's evidence was that Kingspan intended to transition into production of this new R&D version of K15, but that it was never sold because it could not be commercially produced. Even if Kingspan had begun to produce this new version of K15, it's clear they intended to do so covertly rather than announce a new product. This follows from Kingspan's immediately using the test to sell K15. Millichap suggested Kingspan had not deliberately intended to sell K15 using this test, but they could not have done so by accident. Kingspan continued to sell standard K15 on the back of this test until its withdrawal in October 2020. On the shaky foundations of the 2005 test, Kingspan built itself a house of cards by using the BBA certificate to obtain the LABC certificate. That house has collapsed, but not before considerable collateral damage was done. Kingspan's reliance on a single 2005 test, which did not reflect the product being sold, and its subsequent inability to pass tests drove it to push for desktop assessments to be recognised as a route to compliance under ADB. ADB provided external walls should either comply with the linear route or meet the performance criteria in BR 135 using full-scale data from BS 8414 tests. This did not permit desktop assessments, since Appendix A of ADB provided assessments could only be made by laboratories using appropriate standards or guidance. There was at the time no set of extended application or EXAP rules which could be applied to BS 8414 tests, which are system tests and do not lend themselves to extrapolation for discrete products within the system. Kingspan's marketing exercise was an exercise in disingenuity. It claimed the product, as opposed to a system, had passed the BS 8414 test and therefore was acceptable over 18 metres. This despite almost every Kingspan witness professing to have understood that the BS 8414 test was a system test. Similarly, any descriptions of the system provided were deliberately generic. Pargeter accepted that customers were told the 2005 test used non-combustible cladding. It was a deliberate strategy, enabling Kingspan to argue any non-combustible cladding could be used with K15. Kingspan also provided assurances that K15 was fit for purpose and suitable for individual developments on hundreds, if not thousands, of projects for which it had no applicable test report. As Meredith noted in a contemporaneous email, fortunately, 9 times out of 10, they accept our word. When Kingspan was challenged, Meredith confirmed it was always a requirement to defend K15, and he accepted that in doing so, he knowingly misled a number of professionals about K15's fire performance. Kingspan's closing submissions overlook inconvenient documents and evidence. It is almost as if they were absent for key parts of the inquiry. Their suggestion that Kingspan placed great weight on safety, but there have merely been a few unacceptable outbursts, is risible. Philip Heaton me for someone who gives a damn. I'm trying to think of a way out of this one. Imagine a fire running up this tower. Was typical of Kingspan's reaction when challenged. The tenor of Kingspan's internal correspondence is gleeful when its product is misrepresented as limited combustibility when they knew it was not. Following the LABC certificate erroneously characterising K15 as limited combustibility, heralded by Philip Heath's email as great news, Rochford asked, out of curiosity, which fire test result did we use to get this? Heath replied, "We can be very convincing when we need to be. We threw every bit of fire test data we could at him. We probably blocked his server. In the end, I think the LABC convinced themselves cool therm is the best thing since sliced bread. We didn't even have to get any real ale down him." Their entire purpose was to mislead for commercial advantage. Kingspan is also adamant in its closing that its interpretation of ADB is correct insofar as testing the facer only was legitimate. This was rejected by its own staff contemporaneously, who considered claiming class 0 for a facer test when it's meant to be for a product as placed on the market was a bit of a cheat and complete spin, and joked that alls we do is lie in here, because K15 doesn't actually get class 0 when we test the whole product, lol. Under cross-examination, however, Rochfort and Pargeter defended their interpretation. Pargeter asserted that technically it was irrelevant what the foil facer was attached to, but accepted Kingspan was prepared to interpret ADB to make sales and accepted its interpretation was potentially less safe. This is gross understatement. It was positively dangerous. Taking it to its logical conclusion, as counsel to the inquiry illustrated, one could staple the foil facer to a dynamite, call it class 0, and put it on a building. One of the most perturbing aspects of Kingspan's behaviour is its post-Grenfell campaign to persuade government that all products should be subject to BS 8414 testing and the linear route should be abolished. Kingspan's plan was to engineer the tests of non-combustible materials such that they were likely to fail, albeit Kingspan refused to characterise its plan as testing to fail. Pargeter insisted it was merely designed to perform poorly and trying to create a worst-case scenario. This plan was incubated in September 2017 when NHBC began taking a very hard line over desktop studies. Kingspan's audacity after the fire knows no bounds. Both Pargeter's second statement and Kingspan's opening submissions referred to 3 failed tests involving mineral wool, without mentioning any material wool test had passed. Following Pargeter's first cross-examination, Kingspan wrote to the chairman of the Select Committee, suggesting Pargeter had been misled into making a mistake in answering, as he did, that both May and July tests had been designed to perform poorly. Pargeter even produced a 5th statement to justify his position. By that statement, he admitted that the May test had in fact gone ahead and passed. He claimed in his second cross-examination that when first cross-examined, he'd simply been unable to recall that the May test passed, despite admitting there was a little bit of surprise and a bit of disappointment that it passed. By its closing, Kingspan objects to our characterisation of it as seminally causative of the Grenfell disaster, and it claims it did not intend anyone should copy its behaviour. Regardless of Kingspan's intentions, Celotex did go down the Kingspan route. Given the inquiry is concerned with responsibility in the widest sense, it will appreciate that Kingspan's fingerprints are all over this disaster. As a perceived market leader sitting on several industry committees, Kingspan has influenced events leading to Grenfell's non-compliance by causing BCA to issue TGN 18 introducing desktops, which in turn legitimise the widespread use of products such as RS 5000 and K15, and causing NHBC to issue its acceptability of common wall constructions, which permitted the use of ACM combined with K15 without even a requirement for a desktop. The widespread use of such products wrongly gave comfort to Grenfell's designers. We therefore repeat, Kingspan's behaviour was seminally causative of the Grenfell disaster. Celotex's dishonesty began with its rebranding of our FR 5000, a product it knew to be unfit for use over 18 metres, as a new product, RS 5000. Celotex initially intended not to copy Kingspan, but instead test a representative cladding system. But its BS 8414 test for RS 5000 was deliberately engineered to pass and not representative of a normal cladding system. As Roper explained, doing the right thing, namely advertising a system and being transparent about its limitations rather than exploiting market ignorance, would have required a complete re-education of the market and probably a lawsuit brought by Kingspan against Celotex. Having failed its first BS 8414 test, Celotex chose to increase its chances of satisfying BR 135 by using magnesium oxide board to fortify the cavity barriers at level 2 and at the top of the rick, with the intention of misleading it. Roper was instructed by his manager to create a new slideshow for general business use, omitting reference to the failed test and the subsequent use of magnesium oxide. Roper admitted he knew at the time this amounted to a fraud on the market, but despite feeling incredibly uncomfortable, felt unable to challenge since the decision had been made at the highest level. As the marketing literature did not describe the test accurately, it was impossible for those following the BR 135 route to compliance to do so. The literature used the phrase RS 5000 is suitable for use in buildings above 18 metres in height without caveat. The wording also suggested the product, as opposed to a system, met BR 135 criteria. Roper took this wording directly from Kingspan's March 2011 literature. Arconic. The BBA certificate for RB55, which appeared to relate to both rivet and cassette fix versions of the product, was based solely on the test for the riveted version of the product, said to be Class B, but engineered to pass. The test on the cassette product, carried out at the same time, never shown to BBA, had failed, nominally given a Class E. According to Mr. Alban, if BBA had been shown that test, it is unlikely to have issued the certificate in the terms it was. The use of RB55 cassette at Grenfell therefore depended on a certificate obtained by a test engineered to pass. In 2010, Vela admitted Rainabond PE in cassette form doesn't obtain level B. Having said that, this shortfall in relevance to this standard is something that we have to keep as very confidential. Schmidt acknowledged this showed Arconic knew PE cassette was not Class B and that Vela wanted to keep that secret. He admitted Arconic deliberately and dishonestly misled customers about PE cassettes via certification. Schmidt accepted Arconic's senior management was implicated in this cover-up. In summary, PE 55 was, contrary to the BA certificate, neither a Class B nor a Class 0. Arconic argues, perversely, that the engineered test is nevertheless valid and that ADB diagram 40 permitted BBA to equate Class B to Class 0. It did not. Class 0 can only be obtained by testing under BS 476. ADB's table A7 footnote 1 states national fire classes do not equate to Euro classes. The fact that diagram 40 permits either Class 0 or Class B surfaced cladding panels did not entitle BBA to assume the two equated. In May 2012, Vela asked Schmidt to decide what Euroclass to attribute to PE. Vela claimed Schmidt agreed Class B would be removed from marketing literature as it was no longer a wholly accurate reflection of the position. Schmidt claimed not to recall, but Arconic's 2012 literature removed reference to PE. Schmidt accepted it was risky leaving customers to realise that the cassette variant was Class E. This is a gross understatement, and Arconic merits the strongest condemnation for its failure to inform customers of this safety-critical fact. Arconic suggests from 2014 onwards it advised that PE achieved Class E, but this did not happen at Grenfell, despite Arconic deciding in January 14 to reclassify PE, whether rivet or cassette, as Class E. This begs the question why the BBA certificate was not immediately revised to reflect that. Even following the fire, when the BBA certificate was revised in August 2017, whilst it made plain neither PE nor FR should be used over 18 metres, the certificate nevertheless recorded both as Class B. BBA's reviews of RB55 included a catalogue of errors. The critical second triennial review of the certificate in 2014 to 2015, if conducted properly, may have revealed PE Cassette's true performance, was conducted by Amoroso under the supervision of Nocomo. Prior to joining BBA, Amoroso had no knowledge of building regulations or ADB. Nocomo had no training on cladding, did not understand the difference between testing to BS 476 and EN 13501. As he said, I wouldn't say I'm good in fire myself. Amoroso thought the function of the test was confined to checking consistency between publicly available UK technical literature and the text of the BBA certificate. No one had told her certificate holders must provide new test data straight away. BBA is to be severely criticised for its decision to close the second review in 2015, despite Arconic's repeated refusal to provide updated information requested or to cooperate with the review, described by Alban as an exceptional extreme case. The effect of closure of the review was to preserve RB55's certificate, even though by then PE Riveted was Class C and PE Cassette was Class E, and Arconic had internally decided to reclassify Rivet and Cassette as E. BBA elicited none of this information. BBA had no policy governing suspension of certificates and no record of Arconic's failure to provide information. As Moore belatedly concluded, BBA ought to have obtained the relevant information to keep the public safe. The evidence shows BBA instead to be a hopelessly weak institution, too willing to please commercial clients at the expense of ensuring appropriate safety standards. As for BRE, at its most extreme, the behaviour of some individuals at BRE and arguably the institution itself, as senior individuals were aware, amounted to complicity in the manufacturer's frauds. BRE's Phil Clark was heard on video giving advice to Celotex. Roper and Hayes are clear that Clark knew of the hidden magnesium oxide in the rig, and indeed Clark even took delivery of it and the ruby cladding panels. The zebra striped panelling rig would have stood for days before the test. It is inconceivable that BRE was unaware of the irregularities. It is clear BRE as an institution knew that the BS 8414 testing regime was being abused, as it understood the K15 2005 test was indicative. That was how Baker put it, and in evidence he said he thought Kingspan had been trying to pass off the test as a full marketable system. Whilst Howard didn't agree it was indicative, he admitted it was not a complete system and was the only test K15 had to justify its use for a decade. BRE nevertheless issued a classification report over a decade later, despite being aware that misrepresentations had been made about K15. The effect of all this was to allow the manipulation of the BS 8414 testing regime to promote the sale of flammable products unfit for use over 18 metres. BRE's support of K15 for 15 years is indefensible. Given Dr. Sarah Colwell and Dr. Deborah Smith had been the main driver from BRE's side of the joint venture between it and government to get BS 8414 tests to BR 135 accepted into ADB, it seems BRE did not want to undermine their own prodigy by highlighting abuse of the system. BRE was also receiving requests for desktops on the back of its work for Kingspan, and yet must have known, having struggled over a prolonged period to come up with a set of credible EXAP rules for Kingspan based on the testing it was doing, that there was no meaningful way of extrapolating from BS 8414 tests. BRE should have been suspicious of desktops once it understood from Meredith's July 2015 email to Clark, Howard and Dr. Smith that Kingspan was responsible for producing BCA's TGN 18, which introduced the concept of desktops. BRE's Clark allowed Kingspan's test to proceed when they should have been terminated. He tolerated flames overtopping the rig in Kingspan's Trespa test in March 2014, commenting, "A lesser man might have put that out." A better man would have put it out. Although BRE stood up to Kingspan and failed the test, as BRE knew, Kingspan might use even a failed test as the basis for a desktop. Yet Clark was instructed by Howard to prepare a test report. Clark claims to be unaware this failed test spawned 29 desktops, of which 3 were carried out by BRE, and none of which indicated the test had failed to meet BR135, which even Clark found very strange and, to be honest, slightly shocking. Howard, however, was not shocked by the 29 desktops on the failed test. He said, it's a set of data that you can then use if it's going into fire safety engineers to justify a cladding system. Exover, it also carried out desktops based on that failed TRESPA test. One for Kingspan concludes in draft that Larsen FR ACM coupled with K15 would comply with BR135, despite the draft containing numerous queries as to the components of the system proposed. The final version approving this flammable combination was issued on the 27th of June 2017, just 13 days after the Grenfell fire. Both the draft and final versions at KIN 50s 174 and 173 rely on the failed TRESPA test, which shows early termination of the test. Exover's Module 2 submissions disingenuously portray it as an innocent bystander duped by the manufacturers, when in fact, Exover was a part of the problem. Its desktop, dated 26th of May 2015, advised Celotex RS5000 could meet the BR135 performance criteria in 3 constructions, namely brickwork, terracotta, and A1 cladding. But although it also considered aluminium cladding, it did not expressly say that RS5000 combined with aluminium would not comply. Instead, the concluding paragraph confusingly suggested the constructions described in the body of this report meet the requirements. This desktop may have given comfort to NHBC in its acceptability of common wall constructions of July 2016, which approved RS5000 and K15 for use with both brickwork and aluminium cladding without the need for a further desktop. In conclusion, Kingspan's reach into the government's post-Grenfell building safety testing programme to such extent that rig design was by a Kingspan subsidiary cast doubt on the validity of that programme. In any event, the programme's conclusions are only valid if the underlying products are honestly tested. Given this, and the potential for abuse of the BS 8414 and other tests, and the intrinsic flaws in the BS 8414 test, which mean it is not realistic, yet is treated as if it proves a system safe in fire, we invite the panel to give immediate consideration to making urgent recommendations. It may be that the only safe short-term solution is to resort to a prescriptive approach whereby predominantly only non-combustible materials can be used. This is not a viable long-term solution, but given the current lack of competence across certain sectors of industry established in Module 1, there may be no other choice. Those are my submissions, sir.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ms. Barwise. That's very helpful. Well, at that point, we'll take our break for the morning and we'll resume at 20 past 11. We're running slightly behind time, but we've got time in hand, so that doesn't matter. And thank you again. And at that point, we'll break, as I say. Welcome back, everyone. The next statement is going to be made by Mr. James Maxwell Scott, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. So I'm going to check. Mr. Maxwell Scott, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Good. Now, I can't see you at the moment. I don't know whether you can see us, can you?
I can see you, but I'm getting a message saying the host is not allowing me to turn my video on.
Oh. Well, I think we ought to be able to see you as well as hear you. Somebody's going to... Yes, now I can see you now, and you can still see us.
Exactly.
Good, thank you. Well, now you're going to make the closing statement on behalf of RBKC. So when you're ready, off you go. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, panel members, the Council has carefully reflected on the evidence heard by the inquiry in modules 1 and 2. It has at all times sought to do so in accordance with the formal public commitments to candour that it has made. As you know, the Council has submitted a detailed 48-page statement setting out its position on issues relevant to it in these modules. I anticipate that, in accordance with the inquiry's normal practice, that statement will be available on the inquiry's website later today. My aim this morning is to spend no more than 45 minutes outlining the main points made in the written closing statement. I hope that this will be of assistance not only to the panel, but also to the bereaved, survivors and residents, and the many other people who are following the work of the inquiry. This oral statement will be an outline, a summary. It will not involve detailed citation of the evidence that supports the points that I make. Those who wish to analyse those points further will find the supporting evidence set out in detail in the written closing statement and the footnotes to it. Before saying anything further, I wish to remind you of the admissions made by the Council in its Module 1 opening statement. Those admissions related to the Council's Building Control Service. Having considered all the evidence heard in Module 1, the Council considers that it was right to make those admissions, and it stands by them. The Council apologises unreservedly for its failings. The Council is truly sorry for what happened at Grenfell Tower on the 14th of June 2017. The Council would have preferred to make its modules 1, 2 and 3 closing submissions in a single statement. That was the inquiry's original plan, although we fully understand why that plan has changed. The Council had an overarching role in the management and refurbishment of Grenfell Tower, a role which straddles modules 1 and 3. In order fully to understand the Council's position, it will be necessary to read its closing statements in modules 1, 2 and 3 together. The two main topics which I will be focusing on this morning will be the refurbishment project and building control. I need to make it clear, but I will not be addressing in detail the Council's monitoring of the TMO's performance during the refurbishment project. This important topic will be addressed in the Council's Module 3 closing statement, because all of the relevant witnesses from the Council were called in Module 3, not Module 1. What this means in practice is that the Council's position on failings in its systems for monitoring the TMO will be addressed in the Module 3 closing statement, rather than in this one. Nevertheless, it may assist if I make it clear today that in its Module 3 closing statement, the Council will be making further admissions. I'm not going to outline all of them today, but they will include the following. The number of Council officers devoted to monitoring the TMO was insufficient, given the number of residents whose properties were managed by the TMO and the scale and importance of the task delegated to the TMO. There was no Council document setting out what its residual responsibilities were under the fire safety order in respect of properties managed by the TMO. There should have been. The officers in housing commissioning who monitored the TMO received no training on the Council's residual responsibilities under the fire safety order. they should have done. The level of resident consultation envisaged by the 2006 Modular Management Agreement was not achieved. Before moving to my two main topics, may I first make a few general points about overcladding projects. The council was heavily involved in the decision that Grenfell Tower, rather than another building managed by the TMO, be selected for refurbishment. It was also heavily involved in the decision that overcladding the tower would form part of the project. The council has no wish to minimise its involvement in those decisions. It is clear from the reports written at the time that a number of arguments were put forward in support of the proposal to refurbish and overclad the tower. The most significant were the desire to improve the heating system and the thermal performance of the tower. The inquiry's expert architect, Paul Hyatt, describes the desire to improve thermal performance as a laudable aim. In his opinion, applying thermal insulation to the outside of the existing external concrete walls was a good option for improving a building's thermal performance. If thermal insulation were applied to the outside of the tower, it would need to be overclad to protect it from rain. This would in turn provide an opportunity to improve the external appearance of the tower. This was regarded at the time as another argument in support of the proposal to refurbish the tower, but it was certainly not the most important argument used. Grenfell Tower was far from being the first high-rise building to be retrofitted with rain screen cladding. By 2012, overcladding buildings was a growing industry. I invite the panel to think about the position in 2012 of the hypothetical building owner or building manager wishing to overclad a high-rise building, and to ask itself the following questions. Would it be unreasonable for such an organisation to expect that it would be entering a well-regulated market? A market sufficiently well-regulated to ensure that there was minimal risk of unsafe products being proposed for use on its building? Would it be unreasonable for such an organisation to expect that it could eliminate that residual risk by engaging 1, an award-winning architect, 2, a reputable design and build contractor, and 3, a top-tier fire safety engineering firm? The hard truth, which was starkly illustrated by the evidence heard in modules 1 and 2, is that the overcladding market was dysfunctional and poorly regulated. The building owner entering it was entering a world full of potential snares and pitfalls. Some of these were present through the deliberate actions of leading industry players. Others existed because the relationship between manufacturers and those involved in testing and certifying their products lacked the open, collaborative character that could and should have been present. We know all of this now, thanks to the work of this inquiry, but that does not mean that, in 2012, building owners and building managers should have known this or should have foreseen it. Those involved in the project on behalf of the council assumed, wrongly, that all the products suggested by the design team for use on the project were safe. Unfortunately, the members of the design team all seem to have made the same wrong assumption. And, most tellingly, each member of a design team seems to have assumed that other members of the design team were thinking about such matters, and that they therefore did not need to do so. I turn now to my first main topic, the refurbishment project. During the refurbishment project, the council's main role was providing the TMO with the money to pay for the project. The council did not itself enter into contracts with the design team or the contractors. That was done by the TMO. It was well understood within the council that the TMO had authority to choose and appoint contractors and to manage capital works projects. An issue which has attracted a considerable amount of attention, both within and outside the inquiry, is whether cost cutting on the part of the council was to blame for the Grenfell Tower fire. In the circumstances, we have taken the view that it would assist the inquiry for our submissions to focus in particular on cost-related issues, and that is the approach that we've adopted in our written closing statement. In it, we have undertaken a detailed analysis of 15 issues relating to the refurbishment project. We have sought to identify the decisions that were made, who made them, and the extent to which they were influenced by cost considerations. We've analysed not only the choice of materials used, but also choices made in respect of contractors and professional advisors and aspects of the design itself. In this oral statement, I'm not going to cover all 15 issues covered in our written statement, but I will briefly summarise the Council's position on 8 issues and then state some specific findings which we invite the panel to make in its final report. Before I turn to those issues and findings, I need to refer to 2 important concepts. First, public money. Public sector organisations are funded by the public. The money that they have is public money and should be managed and spent in the awareness that it is the public's money. It should be managed and spent prudently. It should also be seen to be managed and spent prudently. Secondly, value for money. Where a public sector organisation purchases goods or services, it is, as a general principle, expected to seek to achieve value for money. Value for money requires consideration not only of cost, but also of quality. Sometimes the cheapest goods or services will also represent the best value for money, but not always. Value for money is not the same thing as cheapest. In practice, a competitive procurement exercise is likely to be the best way of achieving value for money, and is certainly the best way of demonstrating value for money. Much has been made, within and outside the inquiry, of the fact that Kensington and Chelsea is one of the wealthiest boroughs in the UK. It is a matter of record that the neighbourhoods of Kensington and Chelsea are home to many affluent residents, and that property values in Kensington and Chelsea are much higher than the national average. In these respects, it is legitimate to describe the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea as one of the wealthiest boroughs in the UK. But that does not mean that the concepts of public money and value for money do not apply to its council. The TMO was not strictly speaking a public sector organisation, but it was a not-for-profit organisation which derived all of its funding from the council. Principles of public money and value for money therefore applied equally to it. I now turn to summarise the council's position on 8 specific issues relating to the refurbishment. Issue 1, the decision to use Rainabond PE cladding material. In our written closing statement, we analyse this as 2 separate decisions. The first was the decision in principle to use ACM cladding material. The second was the decision to select Rainabond PE rather than Rainabond FR. In our submission, it is important to analyse these 2 decisions separately, in particular because the people involved in them were not the same. Early on in the project, a cladding system with zinc panels was proposed, although at that stage it was just that, a proposal, not a decision. When conditional planning permission was granted by the Council's Planning Department in January 2014, the materials to be used on the external facade of the cladding system were not prescribed. By way of a condition to the planning approval, a decision on the materials was left open for future consideration. By May 2014, the position had changed. The design team had decided in principle to use ACM cladding. The decision to use ACM cladding was taken by the TMO, which had responsibility for major works under the Modular Management Agreement. But Studio E, CEP, Harley, and Ryden all had some involvement in encouraging the TMO to choose ACM cladding. It is right to acknowledge that the choice of ACM cladding material rather than another cladding material, such as zinc, was intended to save money. Studio E, Artelia, and Ryden all identified the use of ACM cladding material as a potential cost saving to the TMO. At no stage did any of the TMO's professional advisors or contractors suggest that the use of ACM carried any fire safety risk? At no stage did any of them suggest that it might not comply with the building regulations or approved document B. But which type of ACM cladding did the TMO choose? The truth is that they were never given a proper choice. Arconic was not the only manufacturer of ACM cladding, but in order to serve their own interests, others involved in the project arranged matters so that, after Ryden's appointment, the TMO were only offered ACM manufactured by Arconic. Rayner Bond PE was not the only ACM cladding manufactured by Arconic, but, and this is the key point, the TMO was never informed that Rayner Bond was available in a fire-resistant core as well as a PE core. For reasons known only to it, Arconic took no steps actively to market the fire-resistant core in the UK or to draw the UK market's attention to the obvious potential benefit that it offered, a core with better fire performance. As a result, all the evidence suggests that Rayner Bond PE was a default option supplied by Arconic to customers in the UK market. The difference in cost between the PE core and the fire-resistant core appears to have been modest, but it is absolutely clear that the TMO did not choose the PE core to save money. It did not, in truth, choose the PE core at all. The TMO was never given the opportunity to make an informed choice between the two cores. It was never even told that there was a choice to be made. Issue 2, the decision to select cassette fixing rather than rivet fixing. The decision to select cassette fixing was made after planning had stated that it would not accept rivet fixing. Cassette fixing cost approximately £80,000 more than rivet fixing. The decision was therefore clearly not cost related. Issue 3, choice of insulation material. Almost all of the insulation material used on Grenfell Tower was Celotex RS5000. It was not a non-combustible material. It should never have been used. The history of how Celotex RS5000 came to be on the building can be summarised shortly. Celotex FR5000 was first suggested by an employee of Max Fordham in August 2012. His focus at the time was on finding a material with a suitable U value. Cost played no part in his suggestion that Celotex FR5000 would be suitable. Studio E, in due course, adopted Max Fordham's suggestion and specified Celotex FR5000. Studio E never properly considered the fire performance of Celotex FR5000 or whether its use over 18 metres would be compliant with the building regulations or approved document B. Celotex FR5000 should never have been specified. Later, Harley substituted RS5000 for FR5000. The chemical composition of RS5000 was identical to that of FR5000. Neither the TMO nor the council were ever informed that Celotex RS5000 had been substituted for Celotex FR5000. There was no discussion of the insulation material during the value engineering exercise. In summary, cost considerations played no part in the choice of insulation material. Issue 4, the decision to reprocure. The decision to reprocure, rather than proceed with Leadbitter, was taken by the TMO. The consistent evidence of the relevant witnesses from the TMO and the council was that the council did not instruct the TMO to make the decision. The council acknowledges that it was aware of the TMO's intended decision in advance of it being made, and that it supported it. By the time the decision was made in July 2013, it had been under consideration for approximately 6 months. It was not taken hastily or lightly. There were a number of factors behind the decision. These included concerns about Leadbitter's lack of experience of projects of this nature, concerns about Leadbitter's lack of experience of working on sites with residents and occupation, concerns about whether Leadbitter was engaged and committed to the project, concerns that Leadbitter was being uncooperative in negotiations with the TMO and Artedia, and concerns that Leadbitter was overcharging. In summary, cost-related issues were clearly a factor in the TMO's decision to reprocure, but they were not the only factor. There was nothing inappropriate in principle in seeking to achieve value for money. Issue 5, the choice of Ryden as principal contractor. The decision to appoint Ryden as preferred principal contractor was taken by the TMO board at a meeting on the 27th of March 2014. TMO did not need formal approval from the council to appoint Ryden, nor did it seek such approval. The TMO did keep the council informed about the tender process and the decision to appoint Ryden. The Cabinet was informed in a report that Ryden submitted the most economically advantageous tender, scoring highest on both price and quality. This was an accurate statement of the outcome of the procurement process. That procurement process had been run by the TMO with assistance from a procurement specialist and Artedia. The procurement exercise was set up so that quality factors counted for 60% and cost factors counted for 40%. The inquiry heard that such a ratio is not unusual. It ensures that quality considerations are given priority over cost considerations. We suggest that such a ratio does a good job of capturing the concept of value for money, and that an organisation which uses it gives appropriate rather than inappropriate weight to cost considerations. Issue 6, the setting of the budget and the choices made in relation to the scope of the works. The estimated budget in the TMO's initial proposal to the Council's Cabinet was £6 million. 2 points should be noted about this initial proposal in 2012. First, the figure of £6 million was very much a rough estimate and was regarded by the Council as a rough estimate. Secondly, the scope of the project had not been finalised at the time. For example, the number of additional homes on the lower floors of Grenfell Tower was subsequently increased. Between 2012 and 2014, there were discussions about the scope of the project. In those discussions, the TMO was informed by Laura Johnson that the council had very specific requirements about the refurbishment of the nursery and the boxing club. These were places which were important to the local community. In this respect, she exercised influence over what was and what was not included in the project. But she did not overrule Peter Madison on this or any other issue. Because the initial estimate was only a rough estimate, the council was not particularly surprised or concerned when the TMO subsequently requested that it be increased. The fact that the initial estimate had been £6 million became ancient history. It did not dictate how the council responded to requests for increased funding. In July 2013, the Cabinet agreed to increase the budget to £9.7 million. In March 2014, the Cabinet agreed to increase the budget again, this time to £10.3 million. At this time, the Cabinet was informed that if the budget was not increased, a possible solution would be to reduce the number of additional homes. At no time was it ever suggested to the Council that a possible solution would be to choose products with lower safety standards. At no time did the TMO or any of its contractors, subcontractors, or professional advisors ever suggest to the Council that, for safety reasons, it was necessary to spend more money on the refurbishment. Issue 7, the choice of Studio E as architect. The decision to appoint Studio E as architect for the refurbishment project was taken by the TMO board at a meeting on the 29th of March 2012. The Council acknowledges that officers from the Council spoke to officers from the TMO about the opportunity to use the calc team on the Grenfell project. And the TMO's decision was clearly influenced by the fact that Studio E had previously been selected by the council to work on the Calc project. An economies of scale benefit was one of the perceived advantages of choosing Studio E, where it was not the only one. It is therefore right for the council to acknowledge that cost-related considerations indirectly played a part in the decision to appoint Studio E. I say indirectly because no other architects were considered by the TMO, and therefore the question of whether Studio E were in fact more or less expensive than other architects did not arise. Studio E had experience of designing and cladding schools, but did not have experience of overcladding high-rise residential buildings. Neither the TMO nor the council asked whether Studio E had experience of overcladding high-rise residential buildings. This was a missed opportunity. Issue 8, the extent to which Exover's services were used. The TMO engaged Exover to provide it with fire engineering services. The council was not involved in Exover's appointment. In the event, the service provided by Exover to the TMO was limited. The most notable example of this is that Exover never issued a final version of its outlined fire safety strategy. In the circumstances, it is right to consider whether Exover's failure to provide the TMO with a final report was caused by cost-related matters. In our submission, it was not. Exover wrote the proposal setting out the scope of services which it would provide. Exover also wrote the proposed fee structure. The TMO accepted both of these proposals. These proposals are relevant for two reasons. First, Exover was entitled to move from one stage of the project to another unless it was formally stood down from the project, which it never was. Secondly, even at the end of the project, the total fee charged by Exover was lower than that stated in its original fee proposal. In short, there was no contractual or financial obstacle to Exover completing the work which it in fact failed to complete. Exover should have completed the brief, which it had agreed with the TMO, and should have been used more on the project. There are a range of reasons why it was not, but the evidence does not indicate that a desire by the TMO or the council to save money was one of them. Findings sought by the council. As set out in our written closing statement, we invite the panel to make the following 6 specific findings. 1. As a general principle, public money should be and should be seen to be managed and spent prudently. 2. The concept of value for money requires consideration not only of cost, but also of quality. It is not a synonym for cheapest. 3. Ensuring that the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project represented value for money and monitoring the budget were legitimate activities. 4. The council acted appropriately in the instances in which it sought, directly or indirectly, to control or influence the budget for the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project. 5. The Cabinet unanimously decided to increase the budget as requested on the 2 occasions on which it was asked to do so. 18th of July 2013, when the budget was increased to 9.7 million, and 19th of June 2014, when the budget was further increased to £10.3 million. 6. Neither the TMO nor any of its contractors, subcontractors, or professional advisors ever suggested to the council that, for safety reasons, it was necessary to spend more money on the refurbishment. Before moving to my second main topic, let me very briefly say 3 things about planning. First, as a matter of law, planning is not concerned with fire safety issues. The council's planning department, when considering the application for planning permission, did not therefore consider whether the cladding posed any fire safety risk. The fact that it did not do so is to be expected and is entirely normal. Secondly, it is clear from the evidence that the design team had decided in principle but it wished to use ACM cladding before the meeting with officers from the Council's Planning Department, which took place on the 8th of May 2014. BSR Team 1 submit that the decision was taken many weeks before that. They state that from March 2014 onwards, the only material put forward to the planners was ACM. Thirdly, although in the Council, planning and building control fell within the same directorate, they were completely separate functions. As the inquiry's experts explained, this was normal at the time. Paul Hyatt said that in his experience, planning and building regulation departments were effectively separate entities within a local authority. Departments do not have any direct dialogue with each other around an application. Beryl Menzies said that she would not have expected to see any interaction between planning and building control. When asked whether she could give any good examples of interaction occurring between a planning department and a building control department, her answer was, to be quite honest, no. I now turn to my second and final main topic, building control. The function of a building control body is now much more clearly understood than it was at the start of Module 1. The function can be provided by either a public sector body or the private sector. In the case of the public sector, it is provided by a local authority building control department. All local authorities are required by law to provide a building control service. In the case of the private sector, it is provided by approved inspectors. In 2010, central government passed legislation to protect private sector approved inspectors from being undercut by local authorities. The legislation required local authorities to run a cost-neutral building control service. To be clear, this was a national legal requirement imposed by central government on local government. It was plain from the evidence of the council's building control manager, John Allen, that he was very conscious of this requirement. He told the inquiry that the restructuring of the council's building control department in 2013 was linked to it. Whether the service is provided by the public sector or the private sector, the role is the same. It is not a design role. Inquiry's building control expert, Beryl Menzies, was very clear on this important point. She said that building control were not part of a design team and were told not to be involved in design. They were there to check the design team's work. Inquiry's expert architect, Paul Hyatt, even had reservations about describing building control as checking. He said, "I don't like checking because it suggests transferring of responsibility." In Hyatt's view, the role of a designer is to produce a compliant design independent of and regardless of building control's views. Because building control is not involved in design, it is not part of a design team. Inquiry's experts were also very clear on this point. Both Paul Hyatt and Jonathan Sekula said that the design team should solve problems and come up with a compliant design before approaching building control. Hyatt said, "I would wish to have my ducks in a row and then go to see building control and say, this is what we're proposing, this is the basis." It is clear from the evidence of the factual witnesses that, in practice, the council's building control officers were not treated by members of the design team as fellow members of that team. This point is well illustrated by an internal email between two employees of Exova, which included the sentence, "Let's hope that Paul Hansen doesn't pick up on it." Hansen was one of the council's building control officers. If Exova's employees had considered Hansen to be a fellow team member, they would surely not have been hoping that he would fail to pick up on non-compliance with guidance. Building control services have a difficult job to do, and it is made more difficult when contractors and construction professionals fail to engage with them in an open and collaborative manner. I now turn to the checking function provided by the Council's Building Control Department. Mr. Chairman, you will recall that in our Module 1 opening, we admitted a number of failings on the part of Building Control. The Council's position is that those admissions were rightly made and it stands by them. I read out the full list of admissions in my Module 1 opening statement. I'm not going to do so again. They are repeated in full in the Council's Modules 1 and 2 closing statement. But I will mention what are probably the three most important ones. Building Control failed to ask for comprehensive details of the cladding system, including the crown. Building Control failed to identify that the insulation materials and products used in the cladding system were not of limited combustibility and therefore did not satisfy the requirements of paragraph 12.7 of approved document B. Building Control issued a completion certificate on the 7th of July 2016. It should not have done so. Mr. Chairman, that brings me to the end of the point that I wish to make today. As I explained at the outset, the Council had an overarching role in the management and refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. Therefore, in order fully to understand the Council's position, it will be necessary to read its closing statements in Modules 1, 2 and 3 together, once the Module 3 closing statements are available. The Grenfell Tower fire caused terrible loss of life and had a devastating impact on many people. The Council apologises unreservedly for the failings admitted in this closing statement and those that it will admit in its Module 3 closing statement. It remains wholly committed to supporting the work of the inquiry.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Maxwell Scott, and we shall certainly bear in mind the need to read all three closing statements, modules 1, 2 and 3, or 1 and 3 in particular, together in due course when we come to consider our decisions. But thank you very much indeed. Now, the next statement is going to be made by Mr. Seward on behalf of the Fire Brigades Union. He's scheduled to speak to us at 12 noon, but I can see Mr. Seward there. He's ready to, I think, ready to address us. Mr. Seward, can you see us? Perhaps we haven't quite got contact yet. Yes.
No, you have, but you were looking at a still image, not the real thing.
Well, Mr.
Now,
it's
now you're looking at the real virtual thing.
Yes, thank you very much. So we've got contact. You can see us, we can see you, and
Yes.
we can see you and vice versa. So if you are ready to make your closing statement for the FBU, then please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. The FBU and those it represents remain humbled by the suffering caused by the Grenfell Tower disaster and committed to a full and open inquiry. Modules 1 and 2 lay at the heart of this inquiry. They have exposed what caused Grenfell Tower to become a combustible death trap in blatant disregard of the safety of the residents and the firefighters who attended the fire in such tragic circumstances. Dame Judith Hackett foreshadowed Modules 1 and 2. In her interim report of December 17, Dame Judith described how the regulatory system covering high-rise and complex buildings was not fit for purpose, leaving room for those who want to take shortcuts. Among her key recommendations was a need for stronger and more effective enforcement with the system, but this requires the necessary resources, she said, to be available and demonstrably independent. Those charged with enforcing must have appropriate enforcement powers. In her final report of May 2018, Dame Judith found subsequent events have reinforced the findings of the interim report and strengthened my conviction that there is a need for a radical rethink of the whole system and how it works. This is most definitely not just a question of the specification of cladding systems, but of an industry that has not reflected and learned for itself. She listed the key issues underpinning the system failure as she saw it, all of which we have now seen played a part in creating the combustible death trap. Ignorance, regulations and guidance are not always read by those who need to read them. And when they do read them, the guidance is often misunderstood and misinterpreted. Indifference. The primary motivation is to do things as quickly and cheaply as possible, rather than to deliver quality homes which are safe for people to live in. When concerns are raised by others involved in building work or by residents, they're often ignored. Some of those undertaking building work fail to prioritise safety, using the ambiguity of regulations and guidance to game the system. Lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities. Module 1 reveals professionals such as Studio E and Exover assuming only a limited role and seemingly no one taking ownership of the design of the cladding system, including the windows, the choice of materials of the fire safety strategy, the fire safety strategy. Everyone said it was someone else's job to ensure the rain screen cladding system was compliant with the building regulations and safe for the occupants. Inadequate regulatory oversight and enforcement tools. The enforcement measures were inadequate, as has been rightly admitted by the Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea, in respect of building control. Mistakes were made, as has been rightly admitted, by the LABC. The construction industry cannot be trusted to regulate itself because ultimately the profit motive prevails over safety and quality. Neither building control bodies, including LABC, NHBC and BAC, nor the BRE or the BBA could stand up to the petrochemical companies that gamed them by failing to disclose material test results or correct glaring errors, by dishonestly fabricating test rigs, or by otherwise manipulating the testing and certification system to further their marketing ends by obtaining test results and certificates which were wrong and misleading. They kept to themselves their knowledge of failed tests, knowledge which would have greatly assisted Mr. Soons and Mr. Lamb, as was immediately apparent to Mr. Simmons from the transcript of his angry telephone conversation with Debbie French in the aftermath of the fire, and which would have led to the revocation of the BBA and BRE certificates relied upon to market their products. The testing and certification bodies chose not to impose such an obligation on the companies and didn't liaise even with each other to share such information as they had. There was no learning from now familiar high-rise facade fires. There was no other testing, e.g. of alternative test rigs with different combinations of products beyond those sponsored by industry. There was no attempt to remedy the known flaws with BS 8418 testing. BRE, by the behaviour of Mr. Clark and Mr. Howard, was guilty of indifference at best or of complicity with the company's malpractice at worst. The independence of these bodies was compromised by their board membership coming from the construction and manufacturing industries and by their dependence on fee income from these sponsors. The panel have our written closing submissions for Module 2 on their lack of independence and rigour, and we trust you will take those points into consideration. Dame Judith came in for widespread criticism from many in the construction and petrochemical industries in the wake of her reports. But the evidence adduced in Modules 1 and 2 about the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project not only bears her out, but has managed to shock almost all those listening. The evidence has shown how wide and deep the malaise has been. Profiteering and deregulation. Arconic, Celotex and Kingspan, intent on accessing the lucrative UK high-rise market, were thus able to exploit a flawed and supine testing and certification regime to achieve a seal of approval for their lethal products. The evidence revealed during Module 2 of the Grenfell Tower inquiry has been a damning illustration of the deadly havoc of the UK's watered-down safety system, privatisation and corporate power. The FBU agrees the LABC's views set out in paragraph 105 of its closing written statement. LABC 20197440 at page 36. They say, in LABC's view, it's plain that in the decade preceding the Grenfell fire, there was a significant degree of confusion in the construction industry as to the fire safety related requirements of the building regulations in respect of rain screen cladding on high-rise buildings. Although Kingspan and Celotex have sought to characterise organisations such as LABC and BBA as experts, to whom manufacturers of thermosetting instruments looked for guidance and to whose opinions they deferred, it is plain that it is manufacturers who had and have far greater knowledge and resources. They know how badly their products perform, They know how to exploit the sometimes clumsy language in the building regulations and the official guidance. They know how to fake fire tests to get better results. They know how to cheat. They know how to lie. Indeed, Kingspan prides itself on its ability to lie. In his statement to the House of Commons on the 19th of January 2021, and that references CLG 30-311-33/90, the Secretary of State for the MHCLG, Robert Jenrick, called on the companies who manufacture, sell or distribute construction products to do the right thing and address the rotten culture and poor practice that has come to light. He was presumably there referring particularly to the malpractices of Arconic, Kingspan and Celtics, which have come to light in Module 2 and which are well detailed in other core participant submissions and not repeated here. But the FBU notes both Kingspan's post-Grenfell fire lobbying of MPs and the Conservative Party's receipt of large donations from the property and construction industries, and fears that calling on the companies to remedy this situation is worthless unless the government accepts that companies cannot be trusted to regulate themselves, distances them from the testing and certification bodies, and encourages respect for health and safety regulation. If allowed too great an influence over regulatory testing and certifying bodies, these companies will always put profit ahead of safety. The lessons of Grenfell must be learned, not lost. Returning to ignorance and indifference, two of the issues underpinning the failed regulatory system, most of the players in Module 1 had often not even read Part B of the building regulations or approved Document B at all, or had only given it cursory attention and lacked an understanding of its most basic concept. The products used in the cladding system were chosen seemingly without any, certainly without any proper consideration of the route to compliance with the building regulations, nor of their fire performance. Those involved in the refurbishment were content to assume these building materials could be used on Grenfell Tower because their use was widespread. One is left asking, did any of the design team read ADB 2013 and BR 135 and apply them to the proposed refurbishment before construction began? None of the architects, fire engineers, or cladding specialists did. Mr. Ashton of Exover is an exemplar of the culture of complacency and arrogance that enabled the disaster. He had no specific training on the risks posed by combustible materials and external wall systems. He did not undertake any CPD on combustible materials in wall systems. He was aware of a number of serious fires worldwide due to inappropriate use of materials, including Lacanol. He was aware of the potential for external fire spread and of BR 135 and the guidance contained therein about the dangers of fire spreading within cladding. But Mr. Ashton thought he knew ADB and so did not need to reacquaint himself with it. Turning to the architects in Studio E, the scale of their ignorance of the material guidance, regulations and testing requirements is staggering, and the FBU contends it could not have escaped notice in any proper selection process. In summary, none of them reacquainted themselves with the building regulations or the guidance. I won't detail all the evidence in support of that proposition. It's all set out in our written submission. The professionals' ignorance was mirrored by all the other people and bodies engaged in the refurbishment. The building regulations were clear, but the guidance was not. The guidance in approved document B, the BRE test reports, the BBA certificates and the LABC approvals were unclear and inconsistent in places, causing uncertainty and confusion about their meaning. The inquiry's experts have advised that architects, Mr. Hyatt, that fire engineers, Dr. Lane, cladding specialists, Mr. Sakula, and building control officers, Dr. Menzies, should have read them all carefully and got to grips with the requirements for installing a rain screen cladding system. It's for the inquiry, however, to decide who else should have mastered the guidance and applied it to their part of the project. The panel may find of assistance the preamble in Her Honour Francis Kirkham's letter of the 28th of March 2013, recommending the DCLG should review and clarify ADB to make it intelligible to the wide range of people and bodies engaged in construction, maintenance and refurbishment of buildings, and not just to professionals. She wrote in her preamble, "The introduction to ADB states that it is intended to provide guidance for some of the more common building situations. However, ADB is a most difficult document to use. Further, it's necessary to refer to additional documents in order to find an answer to relatively straightforward questions concerning the fire protection, properties and materials to be incorporated into the fabric of a building." The FBU contends these were not easy documents to read and understand in the context of the refurbishment, and the diligent reader would find in them no guidance directed specifically to the challenging questions. 1, how to overclad an existing high-rise residential building. 2, how to improve the thermal insulation of such a building without compromising fire safety. 3, how to check the applicability of BBA certificates and BRE test results. They should have been clarified, as Her Honour Francis Kirkham had recommended. Grenfell was not an isolated case, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The large and widespread number of high-rise residential buildings all over the country now found to be blighted with Grenfell-type cladding, multiple breaches of compartmentation, inadequate fire safety measures, and with residents living in fear and accruing unmanageable debt, demonstrate the regulatory regime for the fire safety in high-rise residential buildings was broken by national systemic failures, which allowed and in some respects encouraged the individuals concerned to ignore fire safety and to create buildings capable of total failure in the event of fire. Those national systemic failures created the environment in which a high-rise block of much-needed flats in London was turned into a highly combustible death trap. Systemic regulatory failure is acknowledged in the widespread reforms introduced in the last 12 months, but much more needs to be done. With over 1,000 unsafe high-rise buildings, with Waking Watch in London alone, and still now over 4 years from the Grenfell Tower fire, there can be no doubt, as the London Fire Commissioner and current Mayor have recently stated, property owners and government need to join up and fix this. It's a national disgrace and embarrassment. This ignorance and indifference cannot be explained by the negligence of those involved in the Grenfell refurbishment. Each high-rise residential building with Grenfell-type cladding discovered since the fire was refurbished or built in breach of building regulations. This shows the ignorance and indifference cannot be explained solely by the negligence of professionals involved in the refurbishment, inexcusable though that is. These problems are the result of an unhealthy culture of non-compliance, complacency, and prioritising profit over safety, which has been allowed to develop over the last 15 to 20 years and which has enabled companies to cut corners and game the system. In the Grenfell refurbishment, companies waited to be told what to do by regulators rather than taking responsibility for building to correct standards, aiming at minimal compliance instead of ensuring safety, and careless of achieving non-compliance. This culture affected all who worked on the project. They failed to think far and instead slipped into a culture of always assuming, without checking, that someone else was responsible. They all failed, some more than others. The professionals behaved unprofessionally. The companies gamed the system. They were all careless of the residents' safety in the event of fire. Turning to the deregulatory agenda, the Fire Brigades Union submits that this is the natural result of central government's deregulatory agenda, which has publicly, and we say recklessly, demeaned health and safety on the principle that business interests should not be fettered. The deregulatory agenda was pursued while simultaneously weakening enforcement by obliging enforcing authorities to encourage compliance before taking action, failing to update and clarify guidance, and imposing austerity cuts on local authorities, which led to understaffed and overworked building control bodies up and down the country. We have set out the details in our written opening statement for Module 1 and won't repeat them here. Requiring testing and certification bodies to fund their operation out of fees or to be cost neutral, put them at the mercy of their clients from the petrochemical industry. Profit was put squarely ahead of safety. We hope that these underlying cultural issues will be fully explored in later modules. As Dame Judith says, paragraph 3.23 of her interim report, having a performance-based system which relies on sophisticated judgments places increased reliance on the competence of those undertaking the design and construction of buildings and the skill and rigor of the regulators verifying the quality of work that's done. So the current regulatory regime allows greater flexibility in design and construction, but as the statistics and the evidence shows, the enforcing authorities have denied a commensurate increase in resources to provide and train enough building control officers to do the extra and more complex work involved. RBKC and the TMO made value for money the main driver of the project, ahead of quality and programming. The TMO totally failed to oversee the project to ensure compliance with building regulations. The companies prioritised profit ahead of safety. Most tellingly, Ryden was not prepared to pay for additional architectural or fire engineering advice after assuming its design and build role, and the TMO did not require them to do so or otherwise to fill the gap. Their respective perceived needs to keep costs down and to make a profit pervaded nearly all the really important decisions made, including the initial choices of architect, fire consultant and building contractor, using ACM PE cladding panels in preference to zinc metal ones, and the amount of work done by Studio E and Exover, particularly after Ryden became the design and build contractor. Other core participants have detailed the evidence relating to the multiple failures of those involved in the project and on the conduct of Arconic, Kingspan and Celotex in their dealings with the BVA and BRE. We support and pay tribute particularly to the BSR teams for their detailed and powerful written closing submissions and do not attempt to duplicate them here. We also support and endorse the oral submissions made today by Stephanie Barwise QC. To avoid unnecessary duplication where possible, the FBU now focuses on the TMO's engagement of Studio E, which knocked the project off the rails, of Exover, which kept it off the rails, and of Ryden, which ensured the lack of any further useful professional input from architects or fire safety engineers. Taken together, these flawed appointments set the project on a course of non or minimal compliance, corner cutting, and complacency towards fire safety. Engaging Studio E, the panel may consider the project went off the rails right from the start when the TMO decided to appoint Studio E's architects for the project without any tender exercise or adequate competency and experience checks, which would have constrained the TMO either to seek assurances that Studio E would acquire the necessary training, competence, and experience, or to ensure the appointment of a cladding specialist. Had a competitive procurement process been run for the Grenfell Tower project, Studio E would probably not have qualified, given it had no experience of overcladding an existing high-rise residential building. Mr. Kutcher was engaged as a high-level director. He admitted they did not advise the TMO of Studio E's lack of experience, but he claimed that they already knew. He was obliquely there referring to its appointment to the Calc project. The TMO should have known in any event, because both Studio E's tender for the Calc project revealed no such experience of overcladding a high-rise, and because competency checks should have been undertaken. Mark Anderson of the TMO could not explain this omission. He was aware of the Lacanau fire involving cladding and breach of compartmentation, and of cladding fires in Dubai and elsewhere abroad. When cladding was identified as a feature for the project from December 2011, he realised it needed to be compliant with the building regulations and that fire safety needed to be thought through by the pre-construction professional team. Mark Anderson was also aware of the OJU thresholds and the general principles of procurement law, such as transparency and equality, and was responsible for ensuring that procurement rules and procedures were followed on the GT project. The TMO did not interview anyone else, nor was there any design competition. He said speed of appointment was a significant influence. This, however, did not begin to justify breaching of procurement rules. He agreed that the OJU limit may have resulted in there being a cap on Studio E's fees. Minutes of TMO meetings do not show discussion of OJU limits, despite Mr. Anderson saying they were discussed. This indicates, the panel may feel, that the TMO knew it was behaving improperly. Artelia's minutes mentioned deferring fees to post-stage D due to exceeding the OJU limit. Mr. Soons was non-committal as to whether this shows Studio E did manipulate fees to fall below the OJU limit. That was on day 7. But when confronted by his email to the TMO, which appears at ART 500981, that mentions 50% deferment of stage D fees to keep below the OJU limit, Mr. Sims accepted that this suggests the fees were amended for that purpose. The TMO's appointment of Studio E breached the procurement rules under the Public Contracts Regulations, allegedly to minimise several months of delay and at the request of RBKC. The parties agreed that the TMO would only pay fees up to the overdue threshold of £174,000. This meant that any further use of Studio E by Ryden would have to be paid out of Ryden's already narrowed margin for profit. They failed to instruct Studio E properly. The failure to instruct Studio E properly thus had a profound effect on limiting the work Studio E actually did on the project. Though inexcusable, Studio E's complicity in breaching procurement rules is readily understandable. They wanted the contract. Harder to fathom is why the TMO didn't follow proper process. We may never know. The public interest was ill-served by the appointment of architects who lacked the competency to design the rain screen cladding system. Whatever the motivation, the appointment of Studio E was in breach of the rules, was penny-pinching, and it kick-started the refurbishment project on a course of non-compliance, cutting corners. It was not a legitimate appointment and cannot relieve the TMO of responsibility for important elements of design, material selection and construction, as claimed by the TMO. A proper procurement would probably have resulted in the selection of an architectural practice familiar with the overcladding of high-rise buildings or prepared to appoint a cladding specialist, as Mr. Sakula thinks should have happened, or more familiar with ADB and BR 135, or who would have ensured the fire safety engineering consultants advised fully on the project, and with more understanding of and a more rigorous approach towards fire safety. Studio did not thereafter acquire relevant experience of overcladding an existing high-rise residential building by taking on a suitable architect or cladding specialist, and the TMO did not require them to do so. Philip Booth described the golden triangle of project drivers, price, quality and time, and said the TMO changed the driver from programming, i.e. timing, to value for money at the meeting on the 21st of May 2013. Peter Madison has been overruled by Laura Johnson, he said. The inquiry may want to consider whether it was reasonable to elevate value for money above quality and programming without clarifying that fire safety was not to be compromised thereby. Studio E's failings in the event were legion and causative of the disaster. The main failings are set out in the FBU's written closing statement for Module 1 and not repeated here, save in one respect, which touches on what Mr. Maxwell Scott QC said about building control. Exover provided an outline fire safety report direct to building control at the meeting on the 6th of November 2012, but it made no mention of cladding, and Studio E did not correct this misinformation. Cladding was not discussed. Building control would not have known about Celotex FR 5000 either. The FBU asks the panel to consider whether this was concealment from building control and to take into consideration that among the architectural services Studio E agreed to provide was 7, responsibility for coordinating building regulation approval, and 8, seek to ensure that all designs comply with relevant statutory requirements. And you can see that in the Annex A to the Schedule of Architectural Services of the later agreement with Ryden. If this was concealment, then Studio E were gaming the system and disabling building control from fulfilling their enforcement role under building regulations. Turning to the appointment of Exover as fire consultants, the Grenfell Tower project stayed off the rails when the TMO appointed Exover as fire consultants, but failed to involve them properly at key stages of the project or otherwise ensure they discharged their duties. Knowing Exover on the project team gave false confidence to others involved that fire safety issues were being properly addressed. Exover were directly appointed as fire consultants to the GT project by the TMO's acceptance of their fee proposal of 9th of May 2012 for consultancy services without any bidding process. The proposed scope of work included wide-ranging, albeit ill-specified duties up to REBA Stage 5. For such wide-ranging consultancy duties, Exover agreed fixed fees of £3,300 up to REBA Stage C and of £5,300 for Reba stages D and E, with provision for additional fees. This was a wholly inadequate fixed fee for fire consultancy work on such a large project of overcladding works to an existing high-rise residential building. Exover had full unlimited professional freedom to set out their own scope of the 2012 to 16 primary refurbishment works and for the existing building fire strategy. Another question for the inquiry is, why did they propose such low fees, and why did they fail to carry out sufficient work? They were also tasked with preparing an existing building fire strategy, for which again Exover proposed a wholly inadequate fee, which again was accepted by the TMO, this time on the 31st of July 2012. Neither KCTMO nor Artelia had any objections to the two Exover fee proposals, although they were plainly inadequate to enable the works proposed to the standard required and were very wide-ranging and loose in nature with a clear lack of detail. Likewise, there's no evidence of KCTMO or Artelia attempting to determine whether the items proposed by Exover were sufficient to demonstrate compliance with the building regulations and the fire safety order. The FBU invites the panel to conclude that the appointment of Exover, like that of Studio E, was driven by cost savings, and the failure to undertake a proper bidding process had adverse consequences. The absence of tender documentation led to ignorance or confusion over the nature of the project, in particular that it involved a rain screen cladding system, which necessitated a thorough check on compartmentation. Certainly the reports produced by Exover omitted any mention of the rain screen cladding system and thus failed to take into account the major fire risk proposed by the project. The low fees encouraged a culture of aspiring to minimum compliance instead of trying to ensure the residents were safe in the event of fire. Unavoidable doubts existed about the scope of Exover's retainer from stage F. Despite presenting the biggest risk of a breach, compartmentation between the cladding and the remainder of the building or apartments is not mentioned in Exover's outlined fire safety strategy. Claire Barker's email to Kate Cooney did not mention cladding, but Claire Barker had attended the meeting on Thursday, the 26th of July 2012 with the whole team, albeit she seems not to have informed Kate Cooney that the proposal was to clad the tower, nor did she raise the need for specific fire safety advice on cladding. It seems likely that at this existing building safety strategy report stage, Exover was aware, but Kate Cooney was not, that the project involved cladding. Exover's failings were also legion, and overall, Dr. Lane finds serious incompetence on the part of Exover and very serious professional negligence. In summary, the main people on the project who should have thought fire, Exover, failed to consider the effect on fire safety of the rain screen cladding system. And despite this being the main component of the works, they also repeatedly behaved unprofessionally, prepared an inadequate and unreliable existing building fire safety strategy, draft report of August 2012 by Kate Cooney, failed to inspect fire compartmentation during their site visit, despite the stay put strategy in Grenfell Tower, relying on a high degree of compartmentation, and prepared an inadequate fire safety strategy for the refurbishment, failing to address the spread of fire over the materials of walls and roof and spread of fire from one building to another. Moving on to the appointment of Bryden as design and build contractor, this appointment was also in breach of the procurement rules and likewise demonstrates the adverse consequences of having value for money as the main driver, as opposed to preserving the golden triangle. Bryden's tender documents, which I won't detail, but they are set out in our written submissions, make no provision for instructing Exover nor any extra budget for architectural fees. Secret meetings took place during the tender exercise. Mr. Madison, on behalf of the TMO, preferred the lowest tenderer, Ryden. Mr. Blake and Mr. Henton of Ryden had personal and private access to the top decision makers in the TMO. In March 14, Mr. Madison privately informed Mr. Blake that Ryden were in pole position to win the contract, subject to reducing the total cost by £800,000 through value engineering. On day 28, he denied this meeting. But on day 29, when confronted by emails referencing offline discussions, he was constrained to admit the meeting took place. Mr. Madison's diary revealed several confidential telephone discussions with Mr. Blake over the 12th and 13th of March 2014. His notebook entries evidence a telecon on the 19th of March 2014 that says, agreement with Ryden to keep negotiations and contract price confidential, which seems to refer to the offline discussions they were having with Ryden on the bid. Neither the diary entries, nor the notebooks, nor the secret discussions with Mr. Blake were mentioned by Mr. Blake in his earlier witness statements. Serious doubts thus arise about the credibility of both Mr. Madison and Mr. Blake. Due to an internal error, Ryden had anyway tendered £212,000 below true cost and now had to find savings of over £1 million by value engineering. Mr. Blake accepted it was in Ryden's own interest to push the selection of face-fixed ACM panels, as this was the most obvious way to recoup its £212,000 costing error. Ryden, the lowest tenderer, subsequently entered a building contract with the TMO on the 30th of October 14 at a sum reduced by an astonishing 10%. Already the lowest tenderer. Little wonder they didn't pay for consultancy fees. The FBU contends little weight can be placed on high scores for quality in the tender process when Ryden's tender guaranteed minimum professional involvement in the design and build of the rain screen cladding system. Ryden also recouped its £212,000 costings error by the switch to cassette fixed ACM cladding in lieu of zinc cladding. But Mr. Blake did not advise the TMO of this further saving. This is a clear example of a company putting profit before safety. As to planning permission, neither Ryden nor the TMO nor anyone else involved in the project applied for planning permission to use the cheaper ACM cladding. This may be another example of them gaming the system. As to building control, Mr. Blake claimed he told Studio 8 it was their responsibility to submit information to building control and that he didn't know that the drawings provided to building control showed zinc cladding. The inquiry may find this was another example of Ryden gaming the system. Asked if he ever considered fire safety at any point during the project, Mr. Blake said he considered the adequacy of the project as a whole from day one, not any specific aspect. The inquiry may conclude that both Mr. Blake and Mr. Madison were unlawfully interfering in the tender process, but their evidence is unreliable about the tender process, save where it's corroborated by other reliable evidence. That Mr. Blake's answer about fire safety was tantamount to an admission that he did not think fire. In conclusion and summary, sir, the FBU submits there was an institutional, deep-seated complacency about fire safety, a shameful and inexplicable failure to oversee work of contractors or to seek assurance from properly instructed professionals, an encroachment into the running and funding of the testing and certification bodies by the manufacturing companies, thereby compromising their independence, a failure by most corporate participants to willingly and readily engage with this inquiry with full and frank and early disclosure. And we point out this contrasts starkly with the cooperation and openness given by firefighters and control room staff, as encouraged and facilitated by both the LFB and the FBU, and without any legal advice or assistance or Attorney General's undertaking. Those conclude my submissions, and thank you, sir, and the panel for your patience.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Seward. There's a lot for us to think about there. The next statement will be made by Mr. James Agaros, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of the TMO, but he's not able to start this morning and is scheduled, therefore, to address us at 2 o'clock. So at that point, we will rise. We'll have a slightly extended break at this point, and we'll sit again for the next statement at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.